The brief lecture that we did in class and the video that you just watched have hopefully introduced you to the idea of evolutionary trees, or as they're formally known, phylogenies. Understanding tree thinking, in other words, being able to think in terms of phylogenies, is extremely important, not just within evolutionary biology, but increasingly within all parts of biology. Because as we get more genetic data, we're able to know much more about the evolutionary histories of organisms, and we can use that information to do all kinds of remarkable things. But you have to be able to understand these evolutionary tree diagrams in order to make use of that information. Many analyses in biology, again, especially ones that involve genetic or genomic information, rely on phylogenies. You have to know the evolutionary relationships among organisms to make use of this kind of information. For one example, here is a phylogeny of many different strains of influenza. You probably know influenza as the disease that you get a shot for one or two times a year, or you can get pretty sick. But what's shown here in this red circle are a few closely related strains of flu known as the Spanish flu. An outbreak of Spanish flu in 1918 was devastating. It was a global disease outbreak that killed many people. And one of the things that scientists have worried about ever since the Spanish flu epidemic is, where did this come from? And could it happen again? When you ask a question like, where did an organism come from, what you're really asking is, what is its evolutionary history? And that's information that you can get by comparing lots of present-day organisms and analyzing the characteristics that they have. You can basically go back in time to draw inferences about what an organism's ancestors were like. In this phylogeny, what you see is that the Spanish flu, when you look at what it seems similar to or closely related to, it seems very similar to the group of viruses known as swine flu. And this led researchers to the conclusion that the Spanish flu was actually a hybrid. Basically, it was a mix of the genome of a human flu virus and the genome of a swine flu virus. And that's one of the reasons why it was so deadly. The swine flu virus was completely novel to human immune systems, and so we didn't have any good defense against it. In another case involving disease and phylogenies, there were a number of health workers who came from overseas to Libya back in the 1990s. And there were a sudden rash of cases of children with HIV in the hospital where they were working. And these health workers from abroad were accused of having intentionally infected children in the hospital with HIV. Fortunately, biologists elsewhere who understood how to do phylogenetics got a hold of genetic samples of the virus from the children in the hospital. HIV is a virus that evolves very rapidly. And what the researchers realized was if the medics had, if the infections in the children had begun after the medics arrived in 1998, then there would be relatively little variation in the children's viruses. On the other hand, if, as they suspected, the infections had started well before the medics arrived, then you'd see a much broader phylogeny. And they could predict basically how broad and how much variation you ought to see within the group of viruses in that hospital if the infections had happened before the medics got there. It turned out that the evidence was much more consistent with this second scenario, and largely on the basis of that evidence, the medics were released. So those are just a couple of what must be hundreds or thousands of ways that you can use evolutionary information. A lot of the, especially the more sophisticated tests that you may end up using if you go into biotech or even in some of the medical fields will rely on this kind of evolutionary information. You hopefully have picked this up from the last video, but I'm going to go over this again really quickly. All phylogenetic trees have essentially the same small set of characteristics, although some have some extra bells and whistles on them as well. The set of characteristics that they basically all have are a set of tips. These are usually extant organisms, which means organisms that are alive at the present day. Extant is the opposite of extinct. They also have you almost always have a root. And this root represents the common ancestor of all of the tips. So this group of species altogether is often referred to as the in-group. And it's the group for which you are looking at the ancestry. Okay, in addition to having the tips rather, out here at the present day and the root far back in time, what every phylogeny has is a series of branches that are connected to nodes. Branches represent a lineage that is evolving without splitting. Although I do want to make one thing very clear, is that any phylogeny is just the evolutionary history relating this group of species that are shown at the tips. There may be other species that exist that are not shown here. And so in reality, there could be all sorts of lineages splitting off of this branch. It's just that what has happened to them since then is not shown on this diagram. So when you see an unbroken branch on a phylogeny, it just means that nothing is going on there that is relevant for these species at the tips. It doesn't mean that there's no branching going on or that nothing was evolving along that branch. Okay, and finally, on one of these phylogenies, a node where you have two of these lineages coming back in time and meeting, that represents the common ancestor of two or more lineages. Going forward in time, what happened is that there was a speciation event here. You had one species, one evolutionary lineage evolving, and it split into two that went their separate ways and ultimately become different species. Okay, time is an understood dimension of all phylogenies. Time always goes from the root, which is way back in time, to the current day, which is where you have the tips, or usually to the current day. Sometimes you'll see phylogenies that have explicit dates on them. That's in cases where the splitting events, the nodes, we've got an age for those. We've estimated how far back in time those have happened. However, frequently, as in this diagram, the time axis is just relative time. All that we know here is that this splitting event happened after this one. Some other things that you sometimes see on phylogenies, but not always, is that you may see extinct lineages. This is a line that doesn't go all the way to the present day, and this is because there's something that came off of the lineage that led to modern humans, that is no longer with us. It is not extant, it is extinct. Phylogenies can be drawn in a lot of different ways. And sometimes the extra pieces of information that are added to them, like say these numbers here, can be a little confusing. What you want to get used to, though, is looking at these and understanding what evolutionary relationships they convey. And one thing that's very important is realizing that phylogenies can look very different and still say the same things. So for example, a couple things you've already seen in this slideshow. This diagram reads from left to right in terms of time, whereas this one leads from the bottom to the top. In either case, though, what you're doing is you're going from a root to the tips, and the tree is branching as you go. One important piece about a phylogeny, and you might have picked this up from the video that you just saw, the video I didn't make. But the order in which these species are listed at the tips of a tree does not necessarily matter. What matters is how deep into the tree you have to go to find the common ancestor between two species. Okay, that's really the information that a phylogenetic tree or phylogeny provides. How far back in time do you have to go before finding the common ancestor of two species? So for example, on this tree, you see that if you go back in time, here's the common ancestor of B and C. That's more recent than the common ancestor between A and the other two species. So the common ancestor between B and C is more recent than the common ancestor between A and C, or between A and B. They're the same thing. The common ancestor between A and B here is the common ancestor between B and C. The fact that this common ancestor here is more recent means that B and C are more closely related to one another than either one is to A. So having a more recent common ancestor means that these two species are more closely related to one another than either of them is to species A. And if you look closely at any of the phylogenies on this page, you'll notice that all of them provide the exact same information in terms of evolutionary relationships. B and C are more closely related than either one is to species A. Here the branch lengths are different. That often means that there are different percentages of change along these branches, but still, B and C have a common ancestor that is closer to the present day than this one, so B and C are more closely related to one another than they are to A. Same thing as here, same here, same here, same here, and here, and here, and here. All of these phylogenies are conveying the exact same evolutionary relationship between these species. You should have with you that sheet of misconceptions about evolution that I asked you to take a look at the very beginning of this course, because there are a couple of those misconceptions that are very widespread with respect to evolutionary relationships and evolutionary trees, phylogenies. One very common misconception is that there are some organisms alive today that are more evolved than others are. This is the idea that life is kind of like a ladder. Plants are really primitive, then you get kind of invertebrates, then the lower vertebrates like fish, and finally up the top you have human beings, which are of course the crowning creation of all of nature. In fact, evolutionary relationships look much more like this. All of the species that are alive today have been evolving for the same amount of time since this root. And so it's inappropriate to say that any of them is more evolved than another. You do find that some organisms have a more complex or elaborate or sophisticated feature than another organism may have. And so, for example, we're human beings, and so we like to focus on the central nervous system. Ours is very complicated and sophisticated. It's much more complicated and sophisticated than what you find in, say, a beetle, and way more sophisticated than what you find in, say, a plant. And so on the basis of that, we tend to think of ourselves as being more evolved. On the other hand, from the point of view of the plant, it has a remarkably well-evolved system for gathering light and producing its own energy. Much better evolved than the systems in these organisms, which, and basically we can't gather our own energy. And so the cactus would say that in many ways it is more evolved. The beetle has a tough exoskeleton that protects it against all sorts of harm and environmental threats. It's clearly more evolved than all the other, and why the fish can breathe water. So there. The point is that every organism does better at something or another, but all of them are equally evolved. Another common misconception is that when you have a phylogeny and two lineages separate, one of them just sort of stops evolving. And this is often where we get the idea that some lineages on a phylogeny are more evolved than others. This is the idea that students often have, is particularly because, again, we're most interested in the species that are similar to us, sort of think that, okay, here the tetrapods, the land animals, split off from the fish, and after that, this fish really didn't do very much. They basically stop evolving and stay where they are. And then once the amniotes, the reptiles and mammals and birds, split away from the amphibians stopped doing anything, and so forth. That's not true. Actually, when the tetrapods, the lineage that led to the land animal, the land vertebrates that we know, when it split away from the fish kept on evolving in some really amazing and remarkable ways. And there have been all sorts of novel things that have happened in that evolutionary lineage since they parted ways with the lineage that led to us. Really, what the phylogeny looks like is never like this. It's always like this. Okay, there was some ancestor back here in the very far past, and it gave rise to all these different lineages. And each one of these, at the tips, is genetically just as distant from this ancient fish-like being than any of the others. So this fish-like being that used to exist back in, I think, the Silurian era, or the Silurian epoch, or whatever those geological eras are called, genetically, this fish is no more similar to this than a chimpanzee or a bat is to this creature.